Hello everyone, this is Mr. Hicks over at Reedy High School. Today we're going to be going over part 3 of chapter 1.3 and figuring out some ways that survey bias exists. Ways that survey bias exists include the way in which we ask questions in order to elicit a certain response from people. It could also be that when we take a sample, it's not an efficient means of taking a sample. It could also be people's behavior while they are taking the survey that could also elicit a certain type of response and generate inconsistencies. So we've got a few examples on day 3. We want to start by identifying what is wrong with them and explain why. So number 1 says Mayor Springfield is interested in finding out average age of people in a city. He obtains a list of 300 landlines, and this simple random sample of 300 people with landlines is what he will use to estimate the average age. So it's asking initially what is wrong with this survey. He's only contacting people with landlines. So you could start by writing, he is only contacting people with landlines. And because of this, he cuts out a large swath of the population. Some people may not have landlines. The reasons that they don't have landlines is because they use cellular technologies and they don't feel the need to buy a landline, or it's possible that they could just not afford it. So in this case, you will also want to write people without landlines are not surveyed. And then in part B, it says, do you think the mayor will over or underestimate the true mean age of the people in Springfield and why? We're going to say overestimate. Typically, those with landlines tend to be older in population. With the advent of cellular technology, you find more and more households and younger households not getting a landline at all. So when it asks why, we're going to say overestimate, and then usually people with landlines are older members of the population. Now, this type of inconsistency in the survey has a definition, so you will want to write. Might want to use a different color, but we're going to write off to the side, and we will sort out these definitions a little bit later. This is what we call undercoverage. Undercoverage meaning that there's a certain portion of the population that isn't even taken into account when the simple random sample is generated. When we generate a simple random sample, we want to make sure that everybody has an equal possibility. So everybody in the population has an equal probability of actually being selected to take part in the survey. The next part is administration at a school wants to know the proportion of students that did their homework last night. So they select a simple random sample of 100 kids, and they send them an email asking if they did their homework. So we only end up with 40 responses, and of those 40 responses, out of the 100 in the simple random sample, 36 say that they did their homework last night. So a couple of inconsistencies with this is the fact that only 40, I'm going to go back to using blue, only 40 of the students respond. And this generates a type of inconsistency called non-response. When we survey a sample, we want to make sure that we get responses out of that sample. And if not, we want to make sure that we generate another simple random sample so that we can identify people that will actually participate. Not only that, but the students are being asked by administration whether or not they did their homework. So students are being asked by some authority figure whether or not they did their homework, which might lead to students lying. So students might lie and say they did their homework. And this could be out of fear of getting in trouble, whatever it may be. Here we want to put that the two different types of bias here, say the first one, we call this non-response. We end up with only a fraction of our simple random sample responding to our survey. And then students lying is what we would call response bias. So because they're asked by administration, it is probably the expectation of the students that they respond a certain way, whether they did or not. So for part B, it says, do you think administration will over or underestimate the true proportion of students who did all of their homework last night? In terms of percentages, you'll notice that up here we have 90%. In terms of the percentage, administration will most likely overestimate. So administration will likely overestimate the percentage of students that did their homework. Due to response bias. And then lastly, we have a Boy Scout, Peter, and he wants to know the proportion of people in his neighborhood who support the Boy Scouts. He takes a random sample of 30 homes and then visits them dressed in his uniform. This is another type of response bias. So off on the right-hand side, we're going to say that this is response bias as well. Being that he did show up in his uniform, it is probably the expectation of the homes that he visits, when they know that he is a Boy Scout, that they should say that they do support the Boy Scouts. It's a type of social conformity. So he's influencing how they respond. So we're going to say, what's wrong with this survey? He is influencing how they respond. People, ignore that dog. You could say people don't have the heart to tell him that they don't support the Boy Scouts when he is one. So we'll say people don't want to tell him they don't support when they know he is a Boy Scout. Okay, next question is, do you think Peter will over or underestimate the true proportion of his neighbors who support the Boy Scouts? This is also going to be an overestimate. And because of the response bias, again, people are more inclined to tell him that they support the Boy Scouts due to the fact that he is wearing his uniform, and they don't have the heart to tell him that they don't. So moving on to the next part, this check for understanding on the next page is most likely something that you'll do on your own or in class, but I do want to cover the big ideas that'll be at the top. So from the previous page, we'll go ahead and write the definitions of what we just learned. We learned about undercoverage. And in terms, undercoverage is going to be when some members of the population cannot or are less likely to be chosen. You want to remember that when we take a simple random sample, we want everybody in the population to have the same chance of being selected to participate in the survey. So some members of the population can't or are less likely to be selected. And an example of this is when we were talking about Springfield and landline phones. So that is undercoverage. Next up would be non-response. So non-response is when we were talking about administration. They sampled 100 kids. And it's important to note that this is different from voluntary response. Voluntary response is choosing to participate in a survey, whereas this is just not participating in a survey at all. So we want to make sure that we write that down. So when an individual is selected to participate, they are either unaware or choose not to respond. Make sure you write choose not. And you may want to make just a note at the bottom that this is different from voluntary response. And then the last one that we talked about on the previous page is response bias. There are many different types of response bias. We're going to cover a few. You will actually be doing a project over it. But response bias is defined as a pattern of inaccurate answers. Just so you know, that is not how you spell inaccurate. So pattern of inaccurate responses, and it could be due to multiple reasons. So underneath you could put, could be due to lying, the interviewer, question wording, and then we're going to put etc. So in addition to this, I have some notes for you where we are going to dive a little bit deeper into response bias. So I wrote out some notes. We're going to talk about 6 different types of response bias. So you may want to pause this video. I have this notes document that I will share. So some examples of response bias that you will definitely see in your response bias project. This has to do with wording of the question. Number 1 is whether or not there's too much or too little information. So number 1, too much or too little information. An example of this, let's say we wanted to know if people just like to eat hamburgers. Well, you could ask them if they like to eat hamburgers. Where we get too little or too much information is where we have a question like, do you like to eat hamburgers, which are made from cows and sometimes placed between 2 slices of bread? Just the fact that it's mentioned that there are cows is too much information. It's implied when you're talking about hamburgers for the most part. You could say a veggie hamburger, which would be a different type of response. And in this case, just the mention of cows is too much information. It might cause people to answer in a different manner just because cows are beings, and some people do not like the fact that they have to be killed. They don't really want to think about it when they eat their hamburger. Another thing that could be too little information, we want to know if they like to eat hamburgers, but instead we ask, do you like to eat beef? Well, when it comes to beef, there are many different types of beef. So we're not being very specific about what the type of beef is. Hamburgers are usually made from a specific cut of meat, ground chuck. So in this case, that is an example of too much or too little information. We want to get to the point, and we want to be as concise as possible when asking, and we don't want to try to influence any of the responses of the people taking the survey. So we want to just ask, do you like to eat hamburgers? Another thing is question wording. It is possible in surveys for us to word questions to get a specific type of response just from the wording of the question. So if we wanted to know whether or not people donated to charity last year, it would just be a simple yes or no. But if we wanted to, we could imply some guilt on account of the fact that people might answer this question no. So you might see question wording like, did you donate to a charity last year, like a decent human being? This is an attempt to influence a response out of people. So they would say yes. People would not want to answer no, especially if it's not anonymous, because they feel guilty that they didn't donate to charity, when in reality, the real reason is just perhaps that they didn't have the money or they didn't have the opportunity. So question wording can be used to influence responses in people. Interviewer characteristics, we saw this already with the Boy Scout. Let's say a gentleman dressed in a U.S. Marine uniform and decorated with a Purple Heart arrives at your door to survey whether or not you support current war efforts. Just like the Boy Scout example, the characteristics of the interviewer, what they wear, how they speak, how they behave, might be used to influence a certain type of response, which gives us data that is skewed. Usually we skew that data to create a narrative that we want, and that's not the purpose of data. We normally want to let the data speak for itself. So in this case, interviewer characteristics like the U.S. Marine or like the Boy Scout showing up and people not having the heart to tell them no would be an example of interviewer characteristics. Another type of response bias or thing that could affect response is anonymity, and notice it says or lack thereof. So in the event that people are answering questions and they don't believe that their responses are anonymous and they could get back to them in some way, might cause people to lie. People might be ashamed of how they answer, so they would lie to save face. I put the example here, individuals are more inclined to answer truthfully if they know their responses will not be traced to them. A lot of times you may have seen already when questioning teenagers about drug usage or alcohol usage, we make sure that we don't in any way on these surveys make it get back to the student at all. We want them to respond. We want them to know that there is no specific way to respond. So anonymity when it comes to creating surveys is very influential. Number 5, we got 2 more. So number 5 is manipulating the answer choices. So maybe we ask the question properly, but in terms of multiple choice, we don't actually provide all of the options because we want to receive a specific type of data. So in this case, we ask people how often do they floss at night. We put always, and then we put rarely or never. So clearly, in this case, we're looking for rarely or never. It's rare that people always floss, right? So in the above example, the possible answer choices lack other possibilities like frequently and sometimes skewing our response results. And then the last type, before my headphones die, is revealing other respondents' answers. So this happens sometimes in games like Kahoot, you could see. Sometimes quizzes, when if we select the setting in there, you can see how other people respond. It gives you the number and percentage of other people that answered this question. So before you answer, you may expect that the response with the highest percentage of people answering is the correct one. We don't want to reveal responses of others that may paint a picture in an individual's mind who is taking the survey as to what their responses should be. We want them to answer truthfully. So number 1, we want them to remain anonymous for the most part, unless there's a certain point to people revealing their identity. And we also don't want to paint a picture about how they're supposed to answer the question, like with some response bias, such as question wording. We want them to answer truthfully. So that is it for response bias. Just keep in mind there are other types of response bias. These are the 6 that we have listed on the response bias project, which you will see, and the ones we want you to focus on. Other than that, that is survey bias and some inconsistencies in how we create surveys or how people respond to surveys. Again, any questions, feel free to ask. Have a good day.